We agree that God is the way maker. You can have a seat, but let's just continue to agree that that's who God is, at least from our perspective. I agree with every word of that song. God really is the way maker, especially when you and I can't find our own way. And God really is the miracle worker, which by definition, isn't that the domain of the divine, making miracles happen? And doesn't God always keep his promises? Something that, I'm sorry to say, can't really be said about you and me. The last declaration, though, the light in the darkness part, and we're going to spend some time on that one today. So let's come back to it in a minute. But before we begin a brand new series today, I would like to just spend one final moment in the series we finished last week. At the Movies was one of the most profound experiences we've ever had at our church, and it was one of the most effective. It was the most palatable kind of series for people who don't go to church. And in case you don't know, that's what our church is trying to do. And many of you fit that mold. You meet that definition. You weren't going to church somewhere else. And we created this movement for you. We think God created this movement for you. Because people who don't go to church, and I was one of them as a young adult, we can say it here, people who don't go to church are a little freaked out about what might happen if they do come to church. Because we're allowed to be honest. It's okay. Church people can sometimes be a little weird. And so coming to church it brings a little anxiety if you're not used to going to church. You don't know what's going to happen. You want to make sure that you get an aisle seat so you can make an exit quickly when things get a little freaky. So that's why we create the room like we do. We make it a little bit dark. And we all, even if it's not a church experience, we probably all know what it feels like to have a little anxiety to going to something we've never been to before. So when you can say to your friend, our church is finding spiritual truth inside of the movies that we all love to watch, that's a compelling invitation. It's less anxious, and frankly, it just sounds like more fun, especially if you're not used to going to church. So you trusted us. You took a risk with us, and you invited hundreds of people who don't normally go to church to come to your church with you, and they came. And the results were amazing. Around 3,000 people attended one of our PCC campuses during most weeks of this series. It completely blew away our previous attendance records. But just so you know, our church is not really all that interested in gathering large crowds. What we really want is to help people draw close to God. We do that in 5 ways, and people are now leaning in to know God, to discover their purpose, to get real, to make a difference, and to be the change. Those are our 5 purposes. So God really is up to something at our church. I hope you feel like I do, that I just am privileged. I feel honored to be a part of it all. I hope you do that too. But I want to give you a little secret into how we're pulling some of these things off. Last fall, we kicked off what I think is the boldest initiative we've ever done in 17 years at our church. We called it the More Initiative. And it revealed to us what we tried to envision. What is it God wants to do here? Where does he want to take us? And that required us all, including you, to make a really bold, courageous, risk-taking, faith-filled investment in several areas of our church where we needed more tools. And one of the things we knew we needed was a highly skilled videographer to help us tell stories. Just one stories like Tracy Ratner, and stories like At the Movies, and stories like the pre-service a film that you saw when you came in before church today, or maybe last week or the week before. We've been playing it for a few weeks now. The more commitments you made allowed us to reach farther in a number of ways, and one of those was to bring our video production to the next level. I want to introduce you to my friend Josh Bartlam. Josh doesn't like being on camera because he's usually behind one. But we couldn't have done At the Movies or a number of other things that you see around here without somebody with his skill. Your commitment to the More Initiative and your faithful giving has allowed us not just to do slick presentations, but to live into where people live their lives, like with At the Movies and with Just One stories of real people talking about life change, and 100 other things that we do that are trying to connect people with where they live and what God wants to do in their lives. And I am so grateful. I'm grateful to you for trusting us, for investing here. But more than that, this is really about the people whose lives have been changed. Some of you, many of you here today, And some people who are still coming, they just don't know it yet. So thank you. Thank you for trusting us, because it does matter, and it really is making a difference. Today, we begin a brand new series. And it's not anything like at the movies, but it does have this one thing in common. We've never done a series like this before either. Everybody at our church, everybody in the sound of my voice is trying to define God or improve our definition of God, wrap our mind around God, grasp God, describe God. And that includes people who are just exploring the idea of God. Maybe you're not so sure about God. And then it includes people like me, who have been, I counted myself a person of faith for a long time. Maybe that's the camp you find yourself in. But all of us are trying to take another step to understand God better. And it turns out that Jesus actually defines God for us, not just with the way he lived his life and the example he gave to us, but also directly with his words. He did it 7 times. 7 times in the Bible, Jesus uses an I am statement to define who he really is. And in case you don't know, Jesus and God go together. They are the same. Jesus, God in human form, because there was no way we could wrap our mind around who God was, but in the person of Jesus, we can understand him better. It's one of the reasons that he came. So as we turn today and begin traveling towards Easter Sunday, we're going to begin by stepping back. And I want you to come with me. I'm inviting you to come with me on an adventure of discovery or rediscovery about who Jesus really is. Today we're going to learn something incredibly relevant from 4 simple words that Jesus spoke. We'll expand on them with his own words, but first, he said, I am the light. I am the light. And I'm just going to ask you, would you just say this out loud with me now? I am the light. See, before Jesus became a celebrity, and he was the celebrity of his day, before turning the world and its notions of God and its calendar upside down, before the modern day tools that we have in technology, or even the advancements that Jesus had in his day, before the first human beings, even before the creation of the world, God existed with darkness. The opening words of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, some of the very first words in the whole Bible, tell us this. It says, the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Darkness and the Spirit of God existing, coexisting, living side by side, hovering. But while darkness and the Spirit of God shared the same space, they did not share the same potential. Darkness is an end to itself. Its only purpose is to hide. Its reason for being is camouflage, keeping secrets, its specialty. But God is all about life in its fullest beauty. And for that kind of life to be realized, God's first act of creation was a foregone conclusion. So God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated light from darkness. Now, technically speaking, from that moment, we had natural light just like you and I know it today. We had the direct sunlight hours of daytime and the dimmer reflected sunlight hours bouncing off the moon at night. From the first day of creation until this very day right here, it's been the same, literally. But think with me figuratively for a moment. Think spiritually. Spiritually speaking, after the first day of creation, when we had literal light, we still had mostly spiritual darkness. God started to speak. He spoke through some people like Moses or Abraham or Elijah or Isaiah. So it wasn't a time of total darkness spiritually. It was, however, more like having a flashlight outside at night, or maybe a small lamp in a big room. You can make your way, sort of. You can see through the dimly lit shadows and avoid the obstacles, maybe. You can make out a fuzzy image of God, but he was more like a silhouette. He was more like an outline. You could see him enough to know he's real, just not enough to know what he looks like. And then Jesus arrived. And Jesus' arrival was brilliant I mean, marked from its very beginning with a brand new, brightest star in the sky lighting up the manger scene. His arrival announced and celebrated by the brilliance of angels. Jesus' own baptism illuminated by heaven's targeted glow and the voice of heaven saying to everyone around, God saying out loud, "This is my Son." So as the world wrestled then and now about who Jesus really is, Jesus uses this metaphor that's as easy to grasp today as it was thousands of years ago. It means the same thing to you and me. It's a word picture that everybody gets. Jesus spoke to the people. He said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the light of the world. Light and darkness. Now, both have a purpose, of course. I mean, darkness still has a purpose, which is why Jesus didn't say, whoever follows me will never sleep in darkness. We kind of need that. We need the lights to go out for a while so we can reboot our brains every night, slow our breathing down, disengage our minds. We also need darkness sometimes to reflect, to think. When I'm writing, there are these moments almost every time when I'm trying to write where I'm trying to find a word that is just a little bit just right off the edge of the tip of my tongue. I can't figure it out. I'm trying to find a phrase, or I'm trying to string some ideas together. Other times, maybe I'm trying to solve a problem or figure out a way over an obstacle. And one of the tools that I have, that I use, and maybe you do too, is to close my eyes. I'll take a deep breath. I'll get rid of all the distractions that visually engage me and keep me from focusing on the thing I'm trying to resolve. Then, the darkness provided by the closing of my visual blinds, it eliminates seeing, but it illuminates creativity. So darkness has a place. It has a place when you want to be anonymous, so that, for example, you can cry out to God in the anonymous darkness that we provide you at church here. Or so that you can vote your convictions at the ballot box. Or so that you can go see a counselor without other people knowing, with the privacy that darkness or some form of it ought to be able to provide for those who want it in those moments. We've got a couple of counselors that we refer people to here at our church. One of them, we've referred hundreds, literally hundreds of people to go see from our church. And his name is Don Parks, a friend of mine, one of the most skilled counselors I have ever seen, and really good at getting to the issues and helping people solve their stuff. So when I went to see him a couple of years ago for something I was struggling with, a fact, by the way, I have not an ounce of shame in telling you about, because healthy people go get help. I was sitting in his waiting room because I get there early. You don't want to get there right on time. I got there a little bit early. I went into the waiting room while he finished up with whoever was before me. And you know who I was surrounded by? You. We were all in the waiting room together, and you surrounded by each other. And I would kid Don. I wasn't really kidding. I would say something like, hey man, you need to turn the lights off in that waiting room, or give people a blindfold when they come in the front door or something. Because all these people go to church together, and not all of them want everybody to know that they're here to see a counselor. So he went to work on that and fixed it in some way. But the point is that darkness has a place. It has a benefit. And that's why God didn't eliminate darkness. I mean, he's God after all. If he wanted to, he could have turned the sun on and just said, we're just going to leave this on all the time. Instead, God didn't turn the light off. He quarantined it. He put lines around it. Metaphorically speaking, when it comes to living your life and finding direction for your life and figuring out what God wants you to do and figuring out where God wants you to go and understanding who God wants you to be, well, darkness has no place in any of those things. You don't need darkness for finding your way. You need light. Not just any light. You need the light, which is why Jesus would make such a bold statement and say, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Not only did Jesus define himself as the light, he continues this metaphor with an illustration that scares us, frankly, if we're brave enough to admit it. He says, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. Walking in darkness is terrifying. You can't see where you're going. What might happen? The truth is, we don't worry about walking in darkness today. I mean, if you think about it, you never have to do that. Now, I'm gonna date myself here. I'll date some of you. I'm gonna use an illustration that will be familiar to some of us, and some of you, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about. Here we go. It used to be that when the power went out in the middle of the night, you know what we had to do? Feel our way. We had to feel our way to the closet where we kept the emergency flashlight, and feel our way on the shelf where all the clutter had formed around the flashlight because we haven't used it in a long time. And finally we get the flashlight and we turn it on and it's dead because the batteries are dead, so we curse a little under our breath, but we don't want anybody to know it. And then we feel our way to the drawer where we keep the emergency batteries, smiling along the way because we're very proud because we have a drawer with emergency batteries, and we curse some more when we find out one of the teenagers took the emergency batteries to use it in a video game. So then we have to go really old school, and we feel our way to the candle drawer. Very proud now because we have had backup after backup, and they can't use a candle in a video game. We feel our way to the candle drawer, we feel our way to the matches, and just about the time that we proudly strike the match on the box and see the flicker of light, the electricity comes back on. Well, today you don't have to do any of that. You just forget about all that. We just pull out our phone, which is attached to us. We turn on the handy flashlight that's built into it, and in 2 seconds, let there be light. That's excellent. It's excellent if the electricity goes out. But your iPhone, your Galaxy, your Pixel, it's not going to help you at all if you're trying to find direction for your life. What you need is not a light. What you need is not any old light. What you need is the light. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but that person will have the light of life. This statement right here is powerful on its own. And I'm doing right now what most of us do because the Bible is so rich with truth, so rich with life, that we have to pull one verse or two verses at a time out, and we pull it out of context. So you can't really understand the power of this, even though it's powerful on its own, without understanding what comes before it and what comes after it. See, Jesus wasn't just the master at words. He was the master at timing. And this moment right here, you need to understand the timing. It happens, and the place, it happens in the temple in Jerusalem. And we know that because we're told earlier in the chapter that Jesus is in the temple. So I'm going to share with you some information that you need. And I'm asking you to stay with me. It's not going to take long. Don't check out. I think you'll find this interesting and helpful. The temple is not just one big room. It's a series of rooms. It looks sort of like this. And the most important place in the temple is this small room here called the most holy place, or sometimes called the Holy of Holies. And in it is the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is, think Raiders of the Lost Ark. We'll go back to At the Movies for a second. That's a real thing, the Ark, and it was in the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, and in it contained the stone tablets that God gave to Moses and chiseled the 10 Commandments on. They were in that box along with some other things. It was beautifully ornate, and it was closed and put in there, and then it was thought that above the box hovered the Spirit of God. God dwelt in that room. And no one was allowed in that room except one time a year, one person, a guy called the high priest, was allowed in that room, and he went in there to pray for forgiveness for everyone's sin. That's it. The rest of the year, you couldn't go in, and then only one person. Now, as we move back from the most holy place, you have the holy place and another courtyard, and you get to the outer court. As you move outward, you have increasing ability to move into those rooms with various credentials until you get, so more and more people are allowed the further out you get, until you get to the outside, which is not on this drawing. Around the temple was this courtyard, this massive courtyard called the Court of Gentiles. And anybody could go in the Court of Gentiles. You didn't need to meet any kind of qualification at all to go in the Court of Gentiles. But this room right here is called the Court of Women. And this is where Jesus was. It was named the court of women because women were generally not permitted beyond this. And I know we don't like that. I don't like it either, but it's just part of history. So that's just the way it was. Women weren't allowed in this part. But in here, in order to get from the court of Gentiles into this room, you had to be someone, a man or a woman, who was considered faithfully seeking after God. So you couldn't get in here if you weren't actually seeking to know God or understand God or serve God or something like that. But what that meant was still hundreds of people could get in this room. People who were qualified to be in the court of women, which meant it was a very busy place. Now, around the room, you see these little dots, and they represent offering stations. There were 13 offering stations where people would come and give offerings for different things. And we don't have time to go into what they all were, but what we do need to know is that this room would be filled with hundreds of people coming and going and trying to worship God. They'd all be coming into this room right here, the court of women. There was no better place to find a large group of people who were trying to understand who God is than in that room right there in the court of women. But this is not just an ordinary day in the court of women. This was in a Jewish festival, a religious festival called the Feast of the Tabernacles, or sometimes called the Feast of the Booths. And on the first day of that celebration, there was a ceremony called the illumination of the temple. And it took place in the court of women. And what would happen is there would be surrounding this room 4 massive candelabras. And when the dark came on the first day of that ceremony, on the first day of that celebration, when the darkness came, all those candelabras would be lit. And it was said that it was so bright that every courtyard in Jerusalem would be lit by its brilliance. Then, after they lit this fire, all night long, faithful people would dance before God. They would seek God's face by dancing before Him in the light that radiated from God's dwelling place. Now, imagine that. Jesus is surrounded by hundreds of people all trying to figure out who God is. There's this literal fire burning around Him, and He's saying something like this: "You have seen the brilliance of the temple illumination, and you've seen it pierce the darkness all night long. But you don't need an annual celebration anymore. You no longer need the light of empty religion. You no longer have to battle the darkness on your own because the light of the world is standing before you." He's saying for anybody who follows me, there will be light, not just for one exciting night of the year, but for every day, for every piece of your pathway forward. And Jesus is saying the light around me right here that you're looking at, it's brilliant. But in the end, it just flickers and dies. I am the light that lasts forever. The one who follows me will never walk in darkness. But to get that, you have to have an intimate, ongoing, active, intentional relationship with Jesus Christ. It's the only way to have the light help you find your way. When you and I try to navigate our lives without the light, without following Jesus, we end up lost at best, and we end up in real danger at worst. There's a book called Into Thin Air, written by a guy named John Krakauer, and he tells a pretty riveting tale of climbing Mount Everest. On May the 10th, 1996, this is before everybody in the world had tried to climb the thing. Very few people had made it up, and so he actually reached the summit of Mount Everest. He's standing there. He was only there for a few minutes before he had to head down. His muscles were exhausted, his limbs were frozen, his brain was deprived of oxygen. And as he went down from the summit, some clouds drifted up, which they do quickly in that climate, and they wrapped themselves around him. And soon he was in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, and it started to get dark. So he kind of had to figure out how to navigate his way. He still had a little bit of daylight, and he was able to make his way to base camp number 4 before it got dark, find a tent, get inside before the storm went into its full force effect. But there were 4 other climbers that day, and they got to the summit not long after Krakauer did, but it was after him. And as they were coming down, the same storm came in and hit them, but the darkness came before they made it to camp. So now they're in this whiteout, blinding snowstorm in the pitch black dark, and they couldn't see at all. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know where they were going. So they decided to do the only thing they could think of, which is lay down right there in the middle of the open, sub-zero temperatures, in the middle of a snowstorm, and see if they could make it through the night, which they did. And when they woke up the next morning, the storm was gone, the sun was up, and that's when they discovered that they had laid down one step from a 4,000-foot precipice called the South Wall. They had slept all night on the edge of a cliff in the middle of a snowstorm, 12 inches from death. They had no idea, though, because they were navigating in the darkness. Now, the truth is, this is how many of us live our lives. We're trying to navigate life. We're trying to navigate all kinds of dangers around us, things like discouragement and depression and relationships that don't always go well, and some anxiety and ego, a little bit of greed maybe, anger and fear, selfishness. And I could go on and on because the dangers are endless. I mean, they're hard to see. They're harder to avoid. But the light reveals to us where the dangers are. And following that light illuminates a path so that we can avoid them. Many people are unaware that they sleep on the edge of disaster. But the light is not just about avoiding danger. The light that Jesus offers illuminates life. It is life because Jesus is life. And the life that he offers, the light that he provides for our path, it is faithful and it is constant and it is strong and it is true. So there are many people here today who don't know the way forward. You are not alone. If you feel like your path ahead is unclear, shrouded in darkness and hidden, but God wants to show it to you. He wants to light your way. If only you would follow him. If only you would step into the light.